Have you ever felt like you didn't belong in your own life? Not because you did something wrong, not because anyone pushed you away, but simply because something inside you kept whispering, "This isn't where I'm meant to be." You go through the motions, you meet expectations, you fulfill roles. And yet, somewhere between sunrise and sundown, there's a strange silence inside, not the peaceful kind, but the aching kind. The kind that makes you wonder, what if I've built a life around someone I never truly was? Some people might dismiss this as midlife crisis, spiritual confusion, or just overthinking. But others, especially those who have lived through decades of quiet endurance, know better. They know there are seasons in life when everything looks fine from the outside, but inside, the soul is knocking, ever so gently, asking to be seen again. This is a story of one such person, not a saint, not a guru, just an ordinary soul who, after years of trying to hold it all together, was finally brought to the edge, not by accident, not by illness, but by life itself saying, "Now is the time." It began with a moment no one expected, a moment where breath stopped and something deeper began to breathe. Now you may believe in fate, or you may believe in free will. You may think we each carve our own way forward, or that life unfolds exactly as it should. Wherever you stand, this story will offer you something rare in today's world, a space to remember what it means to be deeply alive. So come closer, not to find answers, but to awaken a feeling. Let us begin. Part 1. A silent childhood in a loud world. There are children who grow up in noisy homes, where voices rise faster than bread in the oven and tempers flare like matches tossed into dry hay. And then there are children who grow up in houses that seem quiet on the outside, calm, controlled and orderly. But inside, the silence hums like a taut wire stretched too tight. It's the kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it stings. He was one of those children. To the neighbors, the family seemed fine. Polite folks, they'd say, hard-working, keep to themselves. But behind the curtains there was no warmth in the way the parents spoke, no shared laughter at the dinner table, no tender pauses in conversation. Everything was functional. Everything was fine. And yet, something vital was missing. The child felt it, though he didn't yet have the words. All he knew was that he was always holding his breath, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if breathing too deeply might disturb the thin veneer of peace that coated the household like a layer of frost. In those early years, he often sat alone in the backyard under a maple tree, whose roots buckled the earth beneath his feet. That tree became his companion. He'd trace its bark with his small fingers and imagine the lives of ants climbing up and down. He'd look up into its branches and wonder what it would be like to have leaves for hands, always open, always touching the sky. And yet, despite the loneliness, there was something quietly growing in him, a deep, almost sacred capacity to observe, to listen not just to what people said, but to the spaces between their words, to feel the ache behind a sigh, to notice when a smile was real and when it was armor. Without knowing it, he was developing a kind of inner clarity, the kind Buddhist monks spend decades cultivating in silence. His solitude wasn't empty, it was fertile. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha once taught, "As a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, so the wise are not moved by praise or blame." This child, through no conscious choice of his own, was already becoming that rock. He learned to remain still amid the shifting emotions of others. He became sensitive to the suffering that couldn't be named. But the price of this early wisdom was high, for in learning how to survive without being seen, he also forgot how to reach out. There's an old Buddhist parable about a turtle who, after being hurt by a storm, withdrew into his shell and lived there for years. One day, a monk came upon the turtle and asked why he never ventured out. The turtle replied, "Out here, the world is too rough." The monk smiled gently and said, "But it is only out here that you may see the moonlight dancing on the pond." In the child's case, his shell wasn't made of bone and skin, it was made of silence, and while it protected him, it also kept out the very light he longed for. And so childhood passed, not in trauma but in a kind of muted fog, a fog that dulled both pain and joy. By the time he reached adulthood, he had learned to play the part well. People found him kind, composed, agreeable. But inside the question remained, who am I, really, when no one is looking? What he didn't know was that life had already begun its quiet work. Like water carving stone, it was preparing him, not for a perfect life, but for a profound one. Part 2. The long sleep of adulthood. Adulthood has a strange way of sneaking up on you. One day you're still wondering who you are, and the next you're paying bills, shaking hands, smiling through small talk, and answering emails that mean very little to the soul. The days fold into weeks, then years, like clothes in a drawer you rarely open. For him, adulthood didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a soft, almost invisible erosion. Not of time, but of aliveness. He did all the things society whispered were right. Got a decent job, rented an apartment, later bought a small house with creaking floors and a backyard full of dandelions. He dated, married, settled into routines. From the outside, it was a life that made sense. Predictable, stable, respectable. But deep down, something within him had begun to fall asleep. Not all at once. No, it was far more subtle than that. It was in the way he stopped noticing the sky on his morning drive, in how the music he once loved became background noise, in how laughter felt more like a performance than release. He still functioned, he still smiled, but he often caught himself staring at nothing, heart adrift in a sea of vague discontent, unable to name what was missing. There's a teaching in Zen Buddhism: when walking, just walk; when sitting, just sit. Above all, do not wobble. But modern life, with its constant noise and restless striving, trains us in the art of the wobble, always half here, half somewhere else, never fully awake in any given moment. He, like many others, became a master of functioning without feeling. He had everything that made up a life, and yet he wasn't truly living. Some nights, lying awake while the rest of the house slept, he would feel something stir within him. Not a voice exactly, more like a presence, a gentle pulse in the darkness, asking, "Is this it? Is this what you came here for?" And he'd push the feeling away with logic, with to-do lists, with television, with distractions. After all, who has time to question the meaning of life when the mortgage is due? And yet, the questions never stopped coming. They arrived in the form of quiet melancholy during sunsets, in tears he couldn't explain while hearing a familiar song, in the way he sometimes caught his own reflection and didn't quite recognize the eyes staring back. It reminded him of a story once shared by a Vietnamese monk. A woman had come to him in tears, saying, "I don't know who I am anymore. I've become a stranger to myself." The monk looked at her and said simply, "Then it is time to go home, not to her house, but to her heart. When you forget the way," he told her, "breathe. Your breath is the bridge between the lost and the found." But he hadn't yet found that bridge. He was still asleep, though the bed was made, the lights were on, and the calendar full. This was not depression in the clinical sense. This was something more elusive, a spiritual numbness, a sleepwalk through life while pretending to be awake. And so he carried on, until one day, life, as it always does, decided that if he would not awaken on his own, then it would do the awakening for him, not through enlightenment, but through rupture, and so began the unraveling. Part 3. The day the mirror cracked. Some awakenings don't arrive like dawn. They come like a lightning strike. Sudden, unforgiving, unavoidable. It was an ordinary day, as many turning points are. He had gone for a walk. One of those half-hearted attempts to clear his head after a particularly numbing week. The world was going about its business. Birds chirping, traffic humming in the distance. A mother jogging with a stroller. A dog barking at nothing in particular. Nothing unusual. But as he stood on the edge of a quiet pond, staring down into the water, waiting, perhaps, for it to reflect something back that could anchor him, a sharp pain bloomed in his chest like fire under glass. His legs weakened. His breath shortened. The world tilted. And then stillness. He didn't remember falling. Just the sound of the wind growing distant. Just a strange, sacred stillness wrapping around him like a blanket, soaked in silence. Not frightening, not cold, just still. In that moment, when the body surrenders and all the walls of identity collapse, something else emerged. Not panic, not regret, but clarity. It was as if a long-forgotten window had opened in his soul, and he was finally able to see the truth. He had lived without truly touching life, and now that life, this body, this earth, this moment, might be slipping away. He wanted to cry out, not because he feared death, but because he hadn't yet fully lived. In the teachings of the Buddha, there is a story of Kissa Gotami, a grieving mother who lost her only child. Desperate, she went to the Buddha and begged him to bring her son back. The Buddha said he would, but only if she could find a mustard seed from a household that had never known loss. She searched everywhere, but every door she knocked on was marked by grief. Eventually she realized that suffering was not hers alone. It was part of being human. That realization did not erase her pain, but it cracked her open to something larger: compassion, humility, and the path to awakening. In a similar way, lying there between heartbeats and heavens, he felt the mirror of his life shatter, not out of punishment, but out of mercy. All the ways he had numbed himself, all the roles he had played, all the years he had lived on autopilot, they passed before him like faded photographs. And for the first time, he didn't judge them, he just saw them, fully, tenderly, as part of a story that had not yet ended. Then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, he felt himself returning. First, the weight of his body, then the harsh rhythm of his breath. He was back, but everything had changed. What followed was not some dramatic transformation. No fireworks, no visions, just a quiet unraveling. A slow peeling away of the life he had built on assumptions and half-truths. A deep knowing that something essential had been seen, and that seeing could never be undone. He didn't tell anyone right away. How could he? How do you explain to someone that your soul took a step beyond the veil and came back with a bruise shaped like longing? Instead, he carried it like a seed, uncertain of what it would become, but sure it had been planted. Something inside him had cracked, and through that crack, light had entered. Part 4. Listening to what was always there. After the rupture, the world didn't look different. The trees were still trees. The sky held the same quiet blue. People still honked their horns, scrolled their phones, and stood in line for coffee. But something in him had changed. Something so subtle it couldn't be named, yet so profound. It touched everything. He began noticing sounds he'd long ignored: the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze, the creak of his floorboards when no one else was home, the way his own breath made a soft hush as it left his nostrils. It wasn't that the world had gotten louder, he had simply begun listening again. Or perhaps for the first time. There's a Zen saying, "The bird sings not because it has an answer, but because it has a song." He had spent so much of his life trying to find answers to questions he couldn't even articulate. But now he found himself drawn more to the listening than to the understanding. And the more he listened, to the world, to others, to the quiet rhythm of his own inner life, the more he realized that nothing had ever truly been silent. He just hadn't known how to hear it. He remembered an old Buddhist story about a monk who had trained for years in silence. One day, his teacher took him to a small mountain spring. "Listen," the teacher said. The young monk tilted his head and replied, "I hear the water." The teacher shook his head gently. "No, not the water. Listen beneath it." The monk furrowed his brow, straining his ears. "I hear the wind now." Again the teacher smiled. "Not the wind either." Frustrated, the monk finally asked, "Then, what am I listening for?" The teacher replied, "The sound of your own heart returning home." That was how it felt now, not a rush of understanding, but a slow homecoming. He began walking each day, not for exercise, but for stillness. He stopped wearing headphones, stopped filling silence with radio chatter. He even found himself speaking less, as if every word needed a reason to exist. One morning, he sat by the window, sipping warm tea, watching a single crow hop across the fence, and suddenly a thought came to him. Not in words, but in a kind of emotional clarity. This is enough. Not the crow, not the tea, but the being with it. The presence, the simplicity of it all. He started doing the dishes more slowly. Water became a companion, not a chore. He'd stand at the sink, fingers submerged in warmth, and feel his heartbeat sync with the rhythm of cleaning. It was, in its own way, a form of meditation, not seated in lotus, not guided by chance, but real, lived, embodied. In Buddhism, mindfulness is not just about being aware, it's about being intimate with what is. And that's what began to happen. He grew more intimate with his own life. The breeze no longer brushed past him unnoticed. The ache in his shoulder became a message, not a nuisance. Even sadness, when it visited, was welcomed like an old friend who had something wise to say. And through it all, a quiet joy returned. Not the ecstatic kind, not the kind that demands celebration, but the kind that sits beside you like a faithful dog, steady, warm, unshakable. For the first time in decades, he no longer feared silence. He trusted it, because he had learned how to listen. Part 5. The art of returning home. The idea of coming home often conjures images of brick walls and warm lights glowing through curtains. But there's another kind of home, one without walls, without locks, without doors. The home you carry inside. The one that waits for you, patiently, even after decades of forgetting. He began to realize that this home had been calling to him all along. In the beginning, it was just a faint pull, a sense of comfort in the simplest of places, like sitting barefoot on the porch steps, or running his fingers across the spines of old books in the attic, or closing his eyes while the dryer hummed gently in the next room. These moments weren't dramatic. They didn't announce themselves, but they felt like home, not because of where he was, but because of how he was being. And that's when it dawned on him, home isn't a destination, it's a way of relating to life. In Buddhist thought, there's a powerful phrase, returning to the one. It doesn't mean disappearing into isolation or rejecting the world. It means remembering that the essence of who we are has always been whole, that we were never truly lost, only distracted. Distracted by roles, responsibilities, achievements, regrets. Life had scattered his attention like wind scatters petals, but now, with each breath, each moment of stillness, he was gathering himself again. One evening, after a long walk beneath the orange glow of twilight, he found himself standing in front of a mirror. He hadn't really looked at himself in years. Not past the shave, the routine, the quick glance. But now he looked deeper, not at his face, but into his eyes. And there was someone there, not a stranger, not the worn-down version of who he used to be, but something softer, something steady, a presence behind the story. And for the first time, he smiled not out of habit, but out of recognition. There's a well-loved Zen parable of a man who spends years searching the world for a sacred jewel, believed to hold infinite peace. He climbs mountains, crosses deserts, visits temples, speaks with sages, all in vain. One day, exhausted and despairing, he returns to his childhood home. While sitting on the floor, he reaches under his old sleeping mat and finds, to his astonishment, the jewel tucked there the whole time, untouched. He had carried it with him all along. This story, he now understood, was never about the jewel. It was about presence. The ability to slow down enough, to soften enough, to remember that what we're truly seeking, peace, love, belonging, has always been within us, but only in stillness can we feel it. So he simplified his life, not out of some grand spiritual ambition, but out of a quiet need for alignment. He let go of obligations that felt performative. He stopped chasing what didn't resonate. He began saying no, not to reject others, but to say yes to his own path. He noticed how even small choices, the kind of tea he drank, the people he spent time with, the way he woke up in the morning, all shaped the atmosphere of his inner home. And perhaps most significantly, he stopped trying to fix himself. That was the greatest shift. He no longer saw himself as a problem to be solved or a project to be perfected. He began to live as someone who had already arrived, not at perfection, but at presence. That shift changed everything. And as he sat one evening by the open window, eyes closed, listening to the distant laughter of children playing in the street, he whispered something under his breath. Not a prayer, not a mantra, just one word: home. Part 6. When you stop chasing, you begin to see. There's a peculiar freedom that begins to unfold when the chase ends. Not because you caught what you were after, but because you finally understood that you didn't need to run anymore. That what you were looking for wasn't out ahead of you, waiting like a prize at the finish line. It was around you, within you, hidden in plain sight. He didn't stop chasing all at once. Letting go of lifelong patterns is more like releasing the tension in a fist that's been clenched for years. Slow, unfamiliar, even a little painful. But he began to notice that the more he let go of striving, the more life offered itself to him freely. He no longer rushed through mornings. Instead, he sat in stillness with his coffee, sometimes letting it go lukewarm as he watched the sun push shadows off the neighbor's roof. He no longer checked off books just to feel productive. He read poems slowly, letting single lines hang in the air like incense. He no longer filled every silence in conversation. Sometimes he just listened, fully, warmly, without the need to respond. And in this quieting, the world softened. One morning at the farmer's market, he saw a boy holding his grandfather's hand, beaming with pride as he carried a basket of peaches. Nothing extraordinary. But in that moment, it struck him. The miracle was not in the scene, but in the seeing. He realized how much beauty he'd overlooked in his life, not because it wasn't there, but because he had been elsewhere, lost in thoughts, ambitions, comparisons, regrets. There's a Buddhist teaching known as the direct path to liberation, to simply see clearly what is, not through the lens of desire, not through the fog of fear, just see. But to see clearly, we must stop chasing. There's a story from the Buddhist tradition about a man who finds himself in a rowboat, paddling desperately upstream. He is exhausted, angry, determined to reach a place he's heard about all his life, a place of eternal peace. Then, midway through his journey, his oar breaks. The river carries him downstream. At first he panics, fights it, cries out to the sky, but eventually he surrenders to the current, and in that surrender, he begins to notice the world around him, the birds, the trees, the cool spray on his skin. He sees that the peace he sought was not a destination, but a way of moving through the world. When he stopped paddling, he began to see. For him too, life became fuller, not by doing more, but by being with more. Being with discomfort, with aging, with the quiet ache of past mistakes, but also being with joy, the kind that hums under the surface of everyday things. The rustle of a newspaper, the crooked smile of a friend, the way light filters through dusty window blinds. And people noticed. His presence had changed. Not louder, not more charismatic, just more there. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to fix people. He simply met them where they were with a gaze that said, "I see you," and somehow that was enough. Eventually, someone asked him, "What happened to you? You seem so at peace now." He paused, smiled, and replied, "I stopped running toward peace. Turns out, it was walking beside me all along." Not everyone needs to brush against death to feel truly alive. Sometimes what we need is far simpler, a moment of quiet, deep enough to hear the soft knocking of our own soul, a pause between obligations, a breath unburdened by expectation, a small space of stillness where the noise of the world fades and something ancient within us stirs. We've followed the story of someone who, like many of us, spent a lifetime performing life rather than inhabiting it, who learned to be polite instead of present, useful instead of whole, until life, in its quiet mercy, cracked the surface just wide enough for light to seep through. And through that opening came listening, stillness, presence, and slowly, a return home. If there's one thread weaving through everything we've shared today, it's this: you were never lost. You were simply busy surviving. You don't have to earn your way back to yourself. You only need to remember how to stop and see, to stop chasing what was never missing, to start listening to what has always been speaking in silence. And if you're at a time in life when things begin to slow down, when the mirror reflects more silver than before, when the house is quieter and the calendar less full, perhaps that's not a sign of decline. Perhaps it's an invitation, an opening, a doorway into the most sacred chapter yet. So ask yourself gently, have I truly sat with myself lately, not as a critic, but as a companion? Have I noticed the beauty in the ordinary? Have I stopped long enough to feel the presence beneath the noise? Because this moment, not tomorrow, not someday, is the only place where awakening can happen, and it doesn't require a crisis, just a willingness to come home. If today's reflection touched a quiet place in you, I invite you to stay with us on this journey. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and walk this path with others who, like you, are seeking not more, but more meaning. And as we part ways for now, I leave you with this: may you walk gently through your days, carrying the quiet wisdom that has always lived within you. Until next time.